Frank Sinatra was singing "Send in the Clowns" when the stage manager walked into the spotlight, not from the wings, not from backstage. He walked directly onto the stage, into the light, while Frank was still singing. The audience at Caesar's Palace noticed immediately. You don't interrupt Frank Sinatra during a performance, not unless something catastrophic has happened. Frank saw the stage manager approaching and his voice faltered, just for a second. Then he stopped singing completely. The orchestra continued, for another measure before the conductor realized Frank had gone silent. Then the music died. The stage manager leaned in close to Frank and whispered something in his ear. The audience couldn't hear what was said, but they could see Frank's face change, could see the color drain from his skin, could see his hand tighten on the microphone stand until his knuckles went white. Frank stood there for a moment, perfectly still, staring at nothing. Then he nodded once. The stage manager walked off. Frank turned back to the audience. There were 2,000 people in the showroom that night. January 6, 1977, they had paid good money to see Frank Sinatra perform. They had flown in from all over the country. They were dressed in their finest clothes, sitting at tables drinking champagne, waiting to be entertained. Frank looked out at them. His face was completely blank. Not emotional, not composed, just blank, like someone had switched him off. He lifted the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. We're going to continue with the show." His voice was steady, professional, the voice of a man who had been performing for 50 years and knew how to control every muscle in his throat. He nodded to the conductor. The orchestra started playing again and Frank Sinatra finished "Send in the Clowns." What the audience didn't know, what they wouldn't know until later, was that Frank's mother had just died. Dolly Sinatra, age 82, had been killed in a plane crash. The private jet carrying her from Palm Springs to Las Vegas had gone down in the San Bernardino Mountains, the same mountains that would kill Dean Martin's son 10 years later. The plane had crashed into Mount San Gorgonio. Everyone on board was dead. And Frank Sinatra, standing on stage at Caesar's Palace, had just been told that his mother was gone, but he kept singing. He sang "My Way." He sang "New York, New York." He sang "The Lady is a Tramp." He performed for another 40 minutes, running through his entire set list like nothing had happened. The audience clapped. They laughed at his jokes. They called out song requests. They had no idea that the man on stage was dying inside, that every word he sang was costing him something, that he was using every ounce of discipline he had learned over 5 decades to not fall apart in front of them. The musicians knew something was wrong. They could see it in the way Frank was moving, the way his timing was just slightly off, the way he wasn't making eye contact with anyone. The conductor kept looking at Frank, waiting for him to call off the show, to walk off stage, to do something. But Frank didn't. He just kept singing. When the final song ended, the audience gave Frank a standing ovation. He bowed. He thanked them. He walked off stage with the same measured steps he always used. And the moment he was backstage, out of sight of the audience, his legs gave out. 2 stagehands caught him before he hit the floor. They helped him to his dressing room. Frank walked like he was drunk, even though he hadn't touched alcohol all night. They got him to the couch and he sat down heavily. His face was gray. One of the stagehands asked if he needed a doctor. Frank shook his head. "Get out," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone get out." The stagehands looked at each other. "Mr. Sinatra, maybe we should get the fuck out of my dressing room." They left. Frank sat alone on the couch, staring at the wall. Dolly Sinatra had not been just Frank's mother. She had been the driving force behind his entire life. The woman who had pushed him to sing when he was too scared. The woman who had bullied club owners into giving him a chance. The woman who had told him, when he was nobody, that he was going to be the biggest star in the world. And she had been right. Dolly was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, but she had the personality of someone 3 times that size. She was loud, she was profane, she was difficult. She picked fights with reporters, with Frank's wives, with anyone who she thought wasn't treating her son with proper respect. Frank and Dolly had a complicated relationship. They fought constantly. She criticized his choice in women. She told him his singing was getting lazy. She showed up at his recording sessions and told him he was hitting the wrong notes. Frank would yell at her to leave him alone. She would yell back that she'd leave him alone when he stopped acting like an idiot. But underneath all the fighting, underneath all the loud Italian shouting matches that made everyone around them uncomfortable, there was an unbreakable bond. Dolly believed in Frank when nobody else did. And Frank knew that everything he had achieved, every success, every triumph, was because this 4'11" Italian woman from Hoboken had refused to let him be anything less than extraordinary. And now she was dead. The plane had gone down in a storm. The wreckage wouldn't be found for 3 days. Frank would have to wait 3 days before they could even begin to search the mountain. 3 days of not knowing for certain, even though everyone knew. The jet had crashed into solid rock at high speed. Nobody survives that. But without bodies, without wreckage, there was still this thin, horrible sliver of hope. And Frank would have to sit with that hope for 72 hours before it was finally, officially extinguished. There was a knock on the dressing room door. Frank didn't respond. The knock came again. "Frank, it's Barbara." Barbara Marx, Frank's girlfriend, soon to be his fourth wife. Frank stood up and opened the door. Barbara took one look at his face and her hand went to her mouth. Oh God, Frank, he didn't say anything. He just stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the dressing room and Frank closed the door behind her. They stood there for a moment. Then Barbara said, "Why didn't you stop the show?" Frank walked back to the couch and sat down, because stopping wouldn't bring her back. Barbara sat down next to him. She tried to take his hand, but Frank pulled away. Not angrily, just automatically. Like he couldn't stand to be touched right now. "Frank, you just found out your mother died and you kept performing. That's not normal." "That's not normal," Frank interrupted. "People paid money to see me perform. I performed. That's the job. The job doesn't require you to destroy yourself." Frank looked at her. "You don't understand. My mother would have expected me to finish the show. She would have been furious if I'd walked off stage. She would have told me I was acting like a baby." Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When do you want to go to Palm Springs?" That's where Dolly had been living. That's where Frank would need to go to handle the arrangements, to deal with the aftermath, to sit in his mother's house and try to process the fact that she was gone. "Tomorrow," Frank said. "I've got 2 more shows scheduled here. I'll do them. Then I'll go." Barbara stared at him. "You're going to keep performing?" "Frank, your mother just died. Cancel the shows. Nobody will blame you." "I'm not canceling," Frank said flatly. "I made a commitment. I'm honoring it. This is insane." "You're in shock." "You need to. I need to sing," Frank said, his voice rising. "I need to get back on that stage tomorrow night and the night after and do my job. Because if I don't, if I stop and think about this, if I let myself feel what I'm feeling right now, I will fall apart. And I can't fall apart. Not now. Not in front of people. Not." His voice broke. He stopped talking and looked away. Barbara didn't push. She just sat next to him in silence. After a while, Frank said quietly, "The last conversation I had with her was an argument." Barbara waited. "She called me 3 days ago. She wanted me to cancel this Vegas run and come to Palm Springs. She said she needed to talk to me about something. I told her I was busy. I told her we could talk next week." And she said. Frank stopped. "She said, 'Fine, Francis, next week. If I'm still here.'" I thought she was being dramatic. My mother was always being dramatic. I didn't think he put his head in his hands. Barbara put her arm around his shoulders. This time Frank didn't pull away. He just sat there, letting himself be held, while the reality of what had happened slowly sank in. His mother was dead. The woman who had created him, shaped him, pushed him, criticized him, loved him with a ferocity that had sometimes felt like violence, was gone. And the last thing he had said to her was that he was too busy to see her. Frank performed the next 2 nights at Caesar's Palace as scheduled. Both shows were professional, technically perfect, emotionally hollow. He sang every note correctly. He hit every cue, but there was something missing. The audience could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. Frank Sinatra was on stage, but he wasn't really there. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark and far away. After the final show, Frank flew to Palm Springs. The wreckage of his mother's plane had been found that morning. There were no survivors. Frank went to Dolly's house and let himself in with his key. The house still smelled like her, cigarettes and perfume and the Italian food she was always cooking. Frank walked through the rooms, looking at her things. Her clothes in the closet, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her cigarettes on the kitchen counter next to a lighter shaped like a miniature bottle of champagne. Frank picked up the lighter. Dolly had bought it in Las Vegas years ago. She thought it was funny. She had shown it to Frank and laughed her loud, raucous laugh. Frank turned it over in his hands. Then he put it in his pocket. He didn't know why. He just needed something of hers, something he could carry with him. The funeral was held on January 10th at the Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Beverly Hills. It was packed. Frank had invited everyone. His ex-wives came. Nancy Sinatra Sr., his first wife and the mother of his children, sat in the front row. Ava Gardner sent flowers but didn't attend. Mia Farrow was in India and sent a telegram. Dean Martin was there. Sammy Davis Jr. was there. All the people who had known Dolly, who had been on the receiving end of her sharp tongue and her fierce loyalty, came to say goodbye. Frank gave the eulogy. He stood at the podium and looked out at the packed church. He had prepared remarks. He had written something down the night before, sitting in Dolly's house, trying to find words that would capture who she was. But when he started to speak, the prepared remarks disappeared. "My mother," Frank said, and his voice cracked. He stopped, took a breath, started again. "My mother was the toughest person I ever knew. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall and she scared the hell out of everyone who met her, including me." There was soft laughter from the audience. Frank continued. "She never told me she was proud of me. Not once. She told me when I was screwing up. She told me when I was being an idiot. She told me when I was making bad choices. But proud, that word didn't exist in her vocabulary." Frank paused. "About 5 years ago, I was at her house for dinner, and she was cooking, like she always did. And I asked her why she never told me she was proud of me. You know what she said?" Frank looked down at his hands. "She said, 'Francis, why would I tell you that? You already know.' And the thing is, she was right. I did know. I knew because of everything she did. Every fight she picked on my behalf. Every club owner she bullied into giving me a stage. Every reporter she called to promote my records. She didn't need to say the words. She showed me every day. Frank's voice broke again. This time he couldn't recover. He just stood there at the podium, crying in front of 200 people. Dean Martin stood up and walked to the front of the church. He put his arm around Frank and guided him back to his seat. Then Dean stood at the podium and finished the eulogy for him. Frank sat in the front row with his children, listening to Dean talk about Dolly, about her fire and her loyalty and her absolute certainty that her son was destined for greatness. After the funeral, Frank went back to performing. He had shows scheduled in New York, in Miami, in Chicago. He honored every commitment. But something had changed in Frank after Dolly died. People who knew him well noticed it. He was quieter, more withdrawn. The easy arrogance that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by something harder, something sadder. Frank made a promise to himself after his mother's funeral. He made a promise that he never told anyone about, but that his children eventually figured out. He promised that he would never again be too busy for the people he loved, that he would never again tell someone he'd see them next week and assume next week would come, that he would never again take for granted that the people who mattered would always be there for the rest of his life. When his children called, Frank answered. When they needed him, he showed up. When they wanted to have dinner, he made time. Nancy Sinatra, his eldest daughter, said years later that her father became a different person after Dolly died, that he became present in a way he had never been before. It was like he realized that life doesn't wait, Nancy said, that tomorrow isn't guaranteed, that you can't put off the important things because you think you'll have time later. But the guilt stayed with Frank. The guilt of that last conversation, the guilt of being too busy, the guilt of finishing a show when he should have walked off stage. He carried it for the rest of his life. In 1998, when Frank Sinatra died, his children found the cigarette lighter shaped like a champagne bottle in his bedroom drawer. He had kept it for 21 years, had carried it with him from house to house, from hotel to hotel. A small piece of his mother that he could touch when he needed to remember that the people who love us don't stay forever, that sometimes they get on a plane in bad weather and they don't come home. And when that happens, all we're left with are the last words we said to them. Frank's last words to his mother had been, "I'm too busy." And for the rest of his life, he made sure that nobody he loved ever heard those words from him again.